conversation, 19. And we have 5 conversations again planned this year, and so hopefully, you know that you're coming to this one. Invitations come primarily from our speakers, so we end up with, usually a good representation of people from a couple of different departments, poli-sci and art in this case, and then a number of honors college students. So anyway, we're very happy to have you. We're very sorry we could not accommodate this crowd in our living room. So it was very gratifying to have such a nice response, really, from our invitation list. The format of the Cardinal Conversations is first, Elena will talk. She's from poli-sci. She's kind of like the supporting speaker. She'll help lead us into the topic. And Julia will be our second speaker. They'll talk for approximately 45 to 50 minutes. And then Q&A. So today we have Julia Fischer from the Art History Department and Elena Sandovici from the poli-sci, and they're going to be talking art, borders, and cultural appropriation. And I had to look up appropriation. If you did not, I'm going to tell you that it is when you take something for your own use, typically without the owner's permission. So today we're talking about art. So.
Hi, nice to see so many of you here, and I am especially grateful that my students could come. I'm Elena Sandovici. I'm an associate professor of political science here at Lamar University. I am also an artist. I am an artist in residence at Hardy and Nan Studios in Houston. And I'm also a little bit of a cultural activist, so I am involved with this movement that is trying to push the fashion industry to give credit to the cultures that they are appropriating. So it was kind of my idea to work cultural appropriation into the title. We are a group of people, an international group of people, and we are mostly an online movement. And we are trying to spearhead events such as Cultural Fashion Day, which is June 24th, and we are trying to get designers such as Tory Burch and the House of Dior to give credit for patterns and symbols and sometimes whole garments that actually belong to indigenous cultures and which these designers are appropriating without giving any credit or acknowledging them. And our hashtag that we like to use is give credit. Anyway, I was looking into some research for this talk, and I kind of knew from the beginning. I thought, okay, my students know me, and the big danger with me doing something like this is that I'm just going to go on this big, horrible, depressing rant, and I'm going to talk about colonialism and post-colonialism and the insatiable greed of the Western world plundering the rest of the world of all of its treasures and leaving everybody in poverty and misery and famine and so on. And then I thought, I have to do something and, well, not be so predictable, but also kind of, maybe be a little bit uplifting. I don't know how to do that, so here goes. But anyway, I have a story for you, and hopefully you like the story. So I was doing research, and I thought, okay, I'm not going to go in there and talk about fashion and symbols and talk about Tory Burch and all that. So I was actually trying to take the lead from Dr. Fischer, who is the expert, and I was looking into some of the cases that she pointed out of artifacts being, stolen, smuggled, plundered, whatever you wish, or at least contested. And I came across the statue of Persephone that was taken from Sicily, actually smuggled illegally out of Sicily, and it turned out in the collection of the Getty Museum, and it turned out somewhere in a beautiful villa in California displayed by the Getty Museum, who had actually bought it. The Getty Museum did not steal it, they bought it, but however it came to be sold to the Getty Museum was definitely shady, or at least the way it was taken from Sicily was shady. So then I was researching that, And then I thought, wait, take a break. Let me look into Persephone, because I used to know the myth of Persephone and I forget about it. What's the deal with this Persephone? Who was she? And I looked into it, and what I found was something very interesting, because I really think that the story of Persephone is actually a metaphor for what is happening with this art that we're talking about tonight. So here's the deal of Persephone. Persephone in Greek mythology, Persephone was the goddess of the underworld and of spring, because spring and the underworld go so well together, you know? It's like spring, the underworld. Anyway, Persephone was never meant actually to be in the underworld. She was the daughter of Demeter, who was the goddess of harvest. And she led a happy, blissful, lovely life and never thought that she would end up where she ended up. One day she was picking beautiful flowers and she was kidnapped. She was kidnapped by Hades, who was the lord of the underworld. She was taken to the underworld against her will. And her mother, Demeter, didn't know what happened. Her mother was looking everywhere for her. So here goes Demeter, and she's looking for her daughter, and she's grieving for her daughter, and she's searching desperately. And she forgets to do the things that she's supposed to do. Remember, she's the goddess of harvest. Well, if there is no harvest, there is no harvest. There's nothing to eat. There's famine and death. It's kind of like, you know, when the bees all die, and we're killing those too. Have to work that into it. Anyway, so Demeter is going around trying to find her daughter, neglecting her duties. There is famine, there is no harvest, and Zeus is very concerned, so he seeks out Demeter and asks her, what are you doing? Why are you not minding your business? And she said, I can't. My daughter's not here. Bring me back my daughter. So Zeus travels to the underworld and talks to Hades and says, hey, you know, could you maybe give her back? I know you like her. She's kind of a sweet thing, but everybody's dying out there. And Hades says, well, you know, okay, whatever. I mean, the honeymoon is over. I could give her back. But we have rules in the underworld. If you eat anything while you're here, you have to stay here. You may never leave. And she ate. She didn't really eat much. I think she must have lost her appetite when she was kidnapped. Go figure. She ate some pomegranate seeds. But she ate the pomegranate seeds, so he could not release her. She had to stay in the underworld. So Zeus finally negotiated a compromise, and the deal was that Persephone would return to her mother for 6 months out of the year, and 6 months out of the year she would go back to the underworld and stay there. So this is how she became the goddess of spring. Think about it. She comes back, the goddess of harvest is happy, everything starts to bloom, everything is beautiful for 6 months, there is a harvest. Then she goes back to the underworld, the goddess of harvest is sad, everything dries up. You know, it's kind of the whole cycle of life and everything, but I think it's a cool metaphor for what is happening with the ancient art, because if you think of the whole thing, the myth of how seasons were created and even the idea of seasons, it's really all about balance. So it's really all about sustainability. And of course, as a political scientist, I'm not supposed to talk to you in any sentimental fashion about any of this, so forget the intrinsic value of art and the fact that people are sentimentally attached and form identities and everything. I mean, really, as a scholar of ethnic conflict, I'm going to tell you that everything is always about resources, and that's it. No sentimental stuff. Well, art is a resource. So taking art from someplace and bringing it someplace else, let's say this beautiful villa in California, actually depletes a place of its resources. So the museum in Sicily that lost the statue of Persephone, that could have been in the museum in Sicily, had to hang a picture of the statue instead. Yeah, okay, you know, whatever, it's sad, blah, 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 but, you know, that's a loss of revenue. That's a loss of tourism. That's a loss to the local economy. Sicily is already poor. So there is this whole story of kind of depleting the world, and even if you think of this question, wait, but aren't the artifacts better off in the Western world? I mean, we could display them at the Met and at the Tate Gallery, and we can display them in Paris, and that's where all the people go, and everybody can see them. That's it's very entitled, and it kind of reeks of privilege and the idea that people in the Western world are more deserving to behold the beauty and all of that. But it's also, again, it's creating an imbalance, and I think that we are in a point of in the world history where we are doing this. If you look at our world is a mess right now, and part of it is because we are creating the underworld. I mean, there are two worlds. There are the privileged, and then there are, I don't know, refugees, people who try to flee famine, people who try to flee wars. The world's population is growing. Resources are scarce. But if we deplete everything everywhere, and we keep fostering this duality, we have the Western world, and then we have the global South, it's unsustainable. Where is all the poverty going to go? Again, let's be totally unsentimental about it, because I'm a political scientist, so I can't tell you that, well, it's sad, even though it is. It's a human tragedy. But let's not focus on the tragedy. Let's focus on actual tangible consequences for us, the Western world, since that's the only thing we ever care about. It's all going to come here anyway. It doesn't stay contained in a place. Poverty travels, famine travels, war travels. People are desperate enough, they're going to want to leave, they're going to want to flee, they're going to seek comfort in places where there are abundance, and then they're going to come, but they're also going to come and they're going to bring all this baggage. They're going to come, with a chip on their shoulder. We are fueling, if we foster this attitude and we keep creating these two worlds, we're really only creating hatred for the Western world that we cherish so much. So, if you look at everything that's happening again in the world, and if you look at what's happening in Europe now, and the terrorist attacks and all the horrible things happening, it's because we are at a point in the world where we need to seek some kind of compromise, we need to seek some kind of balance, we need to try to think globally in terms of sustainability, and we are not doing this. And again, the world's population is expanding. Is this depressing enough? Okay, anyway, this is what I do. This is kind of what I teach. I saw my students were nodding, so they're like, yeah, we've heard all this before. This is what we came for. Anyway, thank you so much. I do want to pass it on to Dr. Fischer, who, as I said, is the expert, and I have a little introduction of her for you. So, so Julia Fischer is an assistant professor of art history, and she teaches survey courses along with upper-level courses in ancient art, Asian art, Renaissance art, and art crime. She received a BA in classics in art history from Loyola University in Chicago, and an MA in classical archaeology from the University of Missouri, Columbia, and a PhD in art history from the Ohio State University. Dr. Fischer's research focuses on iconography, reception and propaganda of Roman imperial cameos, along with issues of looting and cultural heritage. In 2015, her art appreciation textbook, How to Speak Art, Understanding its Language, Issues, and Themes, was published. One section of this text is devoted to issues of art crime. She also wrote the peer-reviewed article, The Monuments Me in Japan, for the fall 2016 issue of the Journal of Art Crime. In 2016, Dr. Fischer was the distinguished faculty lecturer and presented a talk on the monuments men of World War II and their legacy today in Syria and Iraq.
Thank you, Elena. She's brought up a lot of questions. I'm going to bring up more and probably repeat many of them. I think that you all will probably have a lot of questions when we're all done, because I know my students always ask me, what side are you on? What side are you on? And it's so hard. There's the aspect of colonialism, as I'm going to talk about in just a second with Egyptian antiquities. But there's also accessibility at museums like the British Museum. And I have not been to Egypt. It's always been on about my top 5 list of places to go, but I'm not ready to go there with the political climate right now. So what I'm going to do, Elena had a good introduction to this topic, and now I'm going to highlight a few cases. And let me check my watch so I know how much time I have. I'm going to move through these cases chronologically, and so give you an example from Napoleon and his savants in late 18th century, early 19th century. Move on to the Elgin marbles from the Parthenon, and then talk about the Getty Museum, which Elena has highlighted, if there's time, the Metropolitan Museum, and then also what's going on with ISIS right now. Because we too can buy these objects on eBay or Sotheby's or wherever it is, and become a part of this cycle that you probably don't want to be a part of. So as I said, I want to start with Egyptian antiquities. And I've got several stories to tell as well. I'm going to start off by talking about, the guy there in the middle, Zahi Hawass. He's a very famous Egyptologist. He got his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. He was, hold on, I had to write this down because I knew I wasn't going to remember, the former Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities. And now he is still excavating. He's excavated all the important places in Egypt, from the pyramids to Saqqara and down at Luxor. He's a very divisive figure. I've found art historians and Egyptologists either love him or hate him. But he is really the driving force behind trying to get Egyptian antiquities back to Egypt. Because he says a lot of them, most of them were stolen. Egypt was a victim of colonialism, with the West coming in and depleting it of all its artistic resources. And these objects at the time, in the 18th, 19th centuries, Europe was trying to very quickly fill its museums with all these works of art from Egypt, from all over the third world, where they could get them pretty easily. And so there's a big competition between European countries to fill up their museums. Now the story behind the Rosetta Stone, has anyone seen it in the British Museum? And the British Museum is free. A lot of the museums in London are, so you might keep that in the back of your mind too, that the British Museum is accessible, 5 million visitors go to it every year. But with the Rosetta Stone, it was discovered in 1799. Napoleon was in Egypt. He had a military campaign there trying to make it part of the French Empire, and he brought along his team of savants, or experts. He had historians, art historians, archaeologists, all kinds of artists that would record all of Napoleon's conquests, but all of his discoveries too. And so in 1799, in the town of Rosetta, some of his archaeologists discovered the Rosetta Stone. And it dates back to 196 BCE. It doesn't look all that exciting, if we're honest with one another. But you always go to the British Museum and you see people staring at it. It's the same passage written in 3 different languages, and it was the key to deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphics. And so it was really the key to opening up this door to all of this knowledge of Egyptian history and culture. But it was eventually, Napoleon is down in Egypt. Eventually the British come in, they conquer the French, and they take it back to the British Museum, where it is still today. The Cairo Museum had just a facsimile of it. If you go to the Museum of Natural History in Houston, they've got a copy of it too. So you might think, well, why can't they just make a copy? Why is a copy not enough? That's one of the questions I ask my students as well. Zahi Hawass wants that back. He has gotten about 5,000 Egyptian antiquities back to Egypt with the plan of putting them in this museum. And then lower left-hand corner, I've lost my ability to say directions. Lower left-hand corner, that's the Grand Egyptian Museum that's right outside of Cairo and Giza. And you can see the Egyptian pyramids from it. And so the plan is to have all these antiquities placed within there so that you can see them in their original context of Egypt. So that's another question to think about. Do you think Egyptian antiquities should be in Egypt? Should we view them in Egypt, or do we get enough information if they're in the British Museum or in the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston? Where is it best to see it? He does have 5 works on his most wanted list that he hasn't gotten yet, one of which is the Rosetta Stone there. The other one is the bust of Nefertiti on the right. And that bust has a different story. It was excavated in 1912 by a German archaeological team, and at the time they were using what's called the partage system. where the archaeologists, they're digging things up, they have to bring it to an Egyptian official, who was actually, I think in some cases, they were actually French. But you would have to bring all of these artifacts to an Egyptian official who then would have first dibs on it. And supposedly, the German archaeological team dug out this bust of Nefertiti, who's the wife of Akhenaten, who was a kind of a heretic king, the heretic pharaoh. But they dug it out and they realized how important it was, and they disguised it. They put clay on top of it and showed it to the Egyptian official, who passed on it. And so then it made its way to Berlin, and it's in the Neues Museum in Berlin, where it still is. Egypt first asked for it back in 1930, and Hitler eventually said, oh yeah, you can have it back. I don't see any reason why you could have it back. And then he decided he wanted his big museum in Linz, Austria, and his advisors said, no, that's one of the most important works of Egyptian antiquity, and so then he reneged on that. And Zahi Hawass wants it back. He, I think it was back in 2007, said, give it back to us, we need it, at least loan it to us. And the museum in Berlin said, no, it's too fragile to travel. I think if they had loaned it, Zahi Hawass might not have returned it. Now, another thing that I wanted to highlight with Zahi Hawass is that he's actually trying to copyright Egyptian antiquities, things like the pyramids, the bust of Nefertiti. And this was back in 2007. He was on this campaign to copyright those antiquities. And it was all in the hopes of making money so that they could, good cause, so they could finance the maintenance and repairs of all of these archaeological sites within Egypt. But he had these grand plans of all those 120 objects that if you reproduce them in entertainment, like movies, advertising, souvenirs, you would get charged royalties. And this would never pass international copyright laws, and so it didn't take effect. But it gives you an idea of another way that they're trying to raise, or he was trying to raise some money. Now, another famous case, which I'm sure a lot of you know about, are the Parthenon or Elgin marbles. And just a little bit of background there. The Parthenon is the most important site and the most important temple of Greeks' civilization. It dates to about 437 BCE. And shortly after it was built, Greece, or Athens at least, started to decline. They entered into the Peloponnesian War with Sparta, and they lost. And they were losing money. Eventually, centuries later, it was converted into a Christian church, and a lot of the sculptures, and you can see, my laser pointer probably won't show up, but you can see in this drawing where some of the sculptures were, and the pediment, the frieze, the metopies. There was even a big cult statue in the center of the cella. Well, a lot of the metopies, especially when it was converted into a church, were taken off. They were pagan images. It was then converted into an Islamic mosque. And the Islamic religion has a prohibition against imagery, and so even more of the sculpture was taken off and destroyed. Then in the 17th century, there was an explosion within the Parthenon because it's on the Acropolis, about 500 feet above the city of Athens. It was a good fortress, and so the Ottoman Turks used it as a warehouse for explosives, and whoops, there was an explosion that took off the roof and a lot of the other sculptures. So this is a long way of saying that by 1800, when that guy in the upper left came around, Lord Elgin, when he became the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, he got to the Parthenon, and only about half of the sculptures remained on the Parthenon. So keep that in the back of your mind too, that only half of them remained. Now Elgin, I could spend the whole time talking about him. He developed, I won't, but he developed a great love of classical Greek art. And so he originally wanted to make plaster casts of all of these sculptures, but then he got down to Athens and saw the Parthenon and decided he needed the real thing. He was going to take them back to his elaborate villa in England, and so he wanted them all. And so he eventually got permission from the Ottoman Empire. because Greece had been a part of the Ottoman Empire for 350 years by that point. And it's 1801 to 1805 is when he took down half of the remaining sculptures. And there were detractors, there were people that were up in arms, and I think it was, I forget which poet, I think maybe Byron wrote about how bad Elgin was, and someone else described the Parthenon as looking like a gap-toothed old hag because all the sculptures were taken off of it. So he financed this himself, ran out of money. One of the boats that he was able to send to Britain with all these sculptures, and they broke them up in pieces too, but the boat sank and the marbles were sitting on the ocean floor for a while. Eventually they were able to get them back. I don't know how, without modern scuba equipment, but they were able to do that, and by the time they got to Britain, Lord Elgin was bankrupt, and he then had to sell them. Eventually the British Museum got a really good deal. And that's where they are today. And you can see those Elgin marbles, as they're called, or the Parthenon marbles, in the British Museum, right down there in the lower left. And this is after you've seen the Rosetta Stone in the British Museum. And then you walk in and you see the friezes lined up and parts of the pedimental sculpture there in the background. Now, in this case, Athens is, of course, the one that wants these marbles back. They want to restore the unity of the Parthenon and its sculptures, and so they want to have everything back in Athens and in the new Acropolis Museum, which you can see just a little bit past. If you look in the lower right picture with the Parthenon, you can see the big building down the hill. That's the new Parthenon Museum. It's state of the art. They have displayed the sculptures as they would have been on the Parthenon. You have views to the Parthenon, so you can look out the windows and see it. I have not been there. It opened in 2009. I was in Greece in 2000, and that's when they still had the old kind of rinky-dinky Parthenon Acropolis Museum on the top of the Acropolis, and it was very small and not state of the art. But now they've got a really good museum, top-notch museum. They want them back, and they can protect the marbles, and so they want them back. They also say that Lord Elgin did not have permission from the Greeks. They had permission from the Ottoman Turks, and so the marbles were actually stolen. Now, on the British side, and I think I had a quote somewhere here, the British Museum says that the trustees feel strongly that the collection should remain as a whole. So I don't think they're ever going to return them, but they say restore the unity. You can't ever restore the unity of the Parthenon. Half of them were already gone. They also tout Elgin as a savior, not a vandal. That who knows what would have happened to these objects if they had not been removed. Maybe they would have been destroyed in war, or just the elements of nature would have deteriorated them. And just a little fact that they don't advertise at the British Museum, they actually had a disastrous restoration on a lot of these marbles. I can't remember when, I think in the 1950s or 60s, and they actually cleaned them, but took off a lot of the layers of paint because they were originally painted. So they keep saying they're saviors and we protected them, and then they did this disastrous restoration on it. And so they also, the British Museum's never going to return these things. And it is something to think about, as if it's a slippery slope. And should there be a statute of limitations for these things? If it happened so long ago, 1800, has that moment passed, or does the country still deserve to have it? Should the Elgin marbles be displayed as close as possible to the Parthenon? You can chime in when I'm done. Let me see how much time. Oh no. I could go on for a long time. You might have also seen recently George Clooney's wife, Amal Clooney. I don't remember what her maiden name is, Alamuddin, I think. She's a lawyer, and she campaigned and went to trial to try to get the marbles back and lost. So even George Clooney is on the side of, happy wife, happy life. He's got to make sure he supports his wife and is on the side of the return of those marbles. So those two cases, the Egyptian antiquities, the Elgin marbles, I can't really tell you what side I'm on because it's a very complicated issue. I see it from both sides. These next more modern cases are a bit more clear cut for me. I'm now getting into the Getty Museum, which Elena had talked about. And actually in December, I don't know if you know, but there's going to be a movie on John Paul Getty called All the Money in the World. And I just watched the trailer today hoping that it focused more on the Getty Museum, but it's on the kidnapping of his grandson and how he was stingy with his money. I think he negotiated with the kidnappers and didn't give them more money than couldn't be tax deductible. So Getty is up there, and Kevin Spacey he plays John Paul Getty in the movie, but Getty is up there in the top right. A very wealthy man, made his money in oil, and he started to amass a collection of art, and it was building up in his house. He didn't have any space, so he's trying to save some money, a tax write-off. Why not make a museum? And so that's what he built out in Malibu, the Getty Villa. You can still visit it today, and it's designed on an actual Roman villa, based on a real one. Now, Getty started the museum. It was built in 1974. He dies in 1982, and because he's stingy, he's not going to leave his money to his kids, poor kids, but he does leave all his fortune to the museum. And so what this means is that they can procure all of these objects. Money is no object. They can buy anything and everything that they want. And they are the only museum in the United States that's solely focused on classical art. And so they focused on those areas and getting Greek and Roman antiquities. And so they, in the 70s, 80s, they weren't concerned with provenance, which is a record of ownership. And another question to bring up, and actually one of our ideas for a title was finders keepers. Who owns ancient art? You would think that you find something, it's yours, but it's not. Not in Greece and Italy, where they are, like Elena said, this is all about money and tourism and bringing people in, and so they want to keep those antiquities. They want to keep down illegal smuggling, and they want to bring in money to their country. And so, in any case, the Getty wasn't concerned with provenance and where any of these objects came from, and they set about building their collection of basically looted and smuggled antiquities. And it got them into a lot of trouble. Down there at the bottom, the woman, her name is Marion True. She was the curator of the Getty. And she was actually indicted in Italy on charges of conspiracy to smuggle all of these items in and buy them and traffic in them. And she was kind of the scapegoat in it all. Yes, she was doing it, but she claims that the Getty knew what she was doing. Even John Paul Getty, they found letters that say from John Paul Getty, you need to get this no matter what. And he's admitted that he knows these objects are looted, and the museum buys them. So Marion True was brought up on charges. She was eventually acquitted because the statute of limitations had passed. And I don't know what she's doing now. I think she's pretty much laying low. She did have she bought a villa in Greece, and I think she had to sell that. I'm not sure they would welcome her in Greece right now. But the two statues that you see here one was returned. The one on the left was returned. It's a cult statue. The one in Sicily that is now down in Sicily, and I've lived in Italy. Never got down to Sicily because it was a long train ride. And so whenever I talk about that sculpture, I wonder, again, that issue of accessibility. Should it have, well, no, it was gotten illegally, but still, should an object be somewhere where a lot of people can see it, or should it be where it was taken from? The other object of the nude victorious youth, that one is still at the Getty, but Italy is fighting for it. They want it back. The Getty won't give it back to them. It was discovered in 1964 when Italian fishermen were out doing their job, and in their nets is this bronze sculpture, and it's Greek, and Italy wants it back. So I often wonder why does Greece not want it back? But it was, the Italians, the Romans loved all things Greek, so it was probably being exported, and then there was an ancient shipwreck. But in any case, the Italians want it back, the Greeks say no. I'm sorry, the Americans, the Getty says no. That it was found in international waters, that they have a claim to that. So if you go on the Getty website later, you can see that the Getty bronze is still one of their highlights of their collection. But they have had to return about 40 objects to Greece, Italy, Turkey, all of these antiquities that were known to be stolen and sold to the Getty, and the Getty's out all that money. I have students who often ask, well, do they get their money back? And no, it's buyer beware with that. But what they do get out of it is a loan. So they returned a lot of these objects back, and say Italy says, okay, here, you can display a few of these works of art in your museum for a certain amount of time. And that's kind of how they did their trade. There are other American museums that have come under fire: the Cleveland Museum of Art, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, that always are, whenever they acquire something new, they're always on the chopping block. I wanted to highlight a case from the Metropolitan Museum of Art that you might have heard about, involving the Euphroneus crater. It's a Greek vase, a red figure vase, and it was the highlight of the Greek vase gallery in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And the museum bought it in, I can't remember all the dates, they're flying out my brain, but the museum bought it in the 1970s, I think, 72. And it later came to light that these two guys in the corners, the older gentleman in the corners, up at the top, Robert Hecht, was the man who sold the vase to the Metropolitan Museum of Art for millions of dollars. And he was an antiquities dealer. He had in turn bought it from the man on the lower left, Giacomo Medici, who was another dealer in antiquities in Rome. Giacomo Medici, Robert Hecht, these were people that were selling smuggled and looted goods. And so all this came out. The Euphroneus crater is not the only one that was discovered to have been smuggled, but tons and tons of works have come to light. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, at the time they acquired this, they didn't think that they were buying anything illegal. They maybe didn't do their due diligence, but they did end up returning it to Italy and actually to Rome, because this vase was found and smuggled out of an Etruscan tomb in Treveri, which is north of Rome. And so they returned it. It's now on display in the Villa Giulia Museum in Rome. That's where you can see it. And Euphroneus, just as a little side note, he only has 27 known vases. So now one of them is back in the Villa Giulia. And I've never been to that museum. I need to go next time I'm in Rome. I don't think it has the foot traffic as some of these other big museums. Now, I've also wanted to highlight an Asian artifact. I've got just a couple more, and then you guys can ask some questions. This is a Cambodian statue, and it involves the Metropolitan Museum of Art again. The sculpture is from the Khmer Empire, and there were actually two of them that flanked the entrance to the gallery of Cambodian art of the Khmer Empire in the Met. Now, they bought these two sculptures in pieces in 1987 and 1992 from a couple of benefactors. They didn't ask enough questions. They just accepted them and didn't do their research. Well, then it comes to light, I think it was back in 2010, another sculpture from one of these temples was up on the block of Sotheby's auction house, and it was discovered that it had been looted. And you'll notice that the sculptures are missing feet. And the Cambodians are like the Egyptians, they were victims of colonialism and war, and people taking advantage of the chaos of the Khmer Rouge. And a lot of these objects were smuggled outside of their country, and now they're trying to regain them and really assert their independence as a sovereign nation. And so these objects, as Elena was saying, they do have symbolic value, and people get really worked up about them. And so there's a Cambodian group called Aspara, and they're kind of the watchdogs. And so they noticed this Sotheby's auction, and I've got a couple of quotes somewhere. But basically, they took Sotheby's to trial. Cambodia did. And the judge claimed that the Cambodian government had, quote, sufficiently pled facts regarding Sotheby's knowledge that the statue was stolen at the time of import into the U.S. And so they were returned. The ones in the Metropolitan Museum of Art were returned as well. You'll notice, again, those feet up top, those are in Cambodia. And so the looters just cut the statues off at the feet. The diagram at the bottom shows you the temple. It would say about 200 kilometers north of Phnom Penh is where this temple was. And so they have a happy ending. They've gotten these sculptures returned. Now, more depressing news. Sorry to end this on I had a lecture in my art and crime course all about art and terrorism, and afterwards we were all depressed, and I said, let's watch a movie. So I'm sorry if we leave you with some depressing news. But ISIS, I wanted to talk a little bit about smuggling and ISIS and how we could also be a part of this cycle that we want to stop of buying antiquities that are smuggled. ISIS is actually, well, you probably know about the destruction of a lot of the monuments, archaeological sites, works of art in museums, but they're also plundering and looting archaeological sites. And then they smuggle these onto the black market. They post them on eBay for all of us to buy them unknowingly. And so that's happening right now. The picture that you see up the top are some sculptures from Palmyra, which was, a lot of it was destroyed. So I don't want to talk about that because that's too sad. And then the map that you see is of a town called Dura Europos. It was a popular Roman town at the outskirts of the empire. It was really a melting pot of all these different cultures. The picture on the left is before ISIS went in and looted. The picture on the right is afterwards. And you can see how it's kind of like the surface of the moon, all of these craters, all of these holes in Dura Europos. So they're looting wide scale systematically in order to ultimately fund terrorism. And so, we've got to do our due diligence as well. And if you are an art collector, make sure that something actually does have a clear provenance. Don't buy it on eBay. Even if you're buying something at an auction house, you've got to be careful about what you buy. Now, last year in 2016, Obama and the U.S. Senate blocked the import of art and artifacts from Syria to try to stop all of the antiquities going out, because Syrian antiquities were actually America's #1 imported artifacts, really. It was about $11 million in 2016. And so the bill was the Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property Act. Now, the last thing I wanted to tell you about, and this is in relation to ISIS. So did anyone hear about Hobby Lobby over the summer? Yeah. Well, Hobby Lobby, which is a very Christian company, Its CEO, its president, Steve Green, has been working on building the Museum of the Bible. And does anyone keep seeing commercials for it? I now have Sling, and for some reason, once I started thinking about Hobby Lobby and what they were doing, I keep seeing commercials of the Museum of the Bible, and I'm like, but in any case, you see a photograph, or at least a plan of the Museum of the Bible, which is set to open in DC in 2017 in November. And it's an 8-floor museum, all to do with the Bible, lots of interactive exhibitions and artifacts. And so what happened over the summer was that Hobby Lobby was found to have, and Steve Green, the president, he bought all of these illegal antiquities. Probably they had been smuggled by ISIS. So that very Christian company is funding terrorism. But in any case, they paid $1.6 million for about 5,500 artifacts, things like clay tablets, cylinder seals. All of these things were going to be placed into the Museum of the Bible. And it's since been found out that they were smuggled out of Iraq and that they were mislabeled. They were labeled as things like clay tablets and just some very vague references. No one really knew what they were. And they were also coming from the United Arab Emirates and Israel, so they had some in-between stops, so things didn't look suspicious. Now, I've got a couple of other quotes that I thought you might like. The president, Steve Green, said that, Hobby Lobby and the Museum of the Bible were new to the world of acquiring these items and did not fully appreciate the complexities of the acquisitions process. This resulted in some regrettable mistakes. But they actually had an expert on cultural property law that they hired, and that said to Steve Green and the other higher-ups at Hobby Lobby that, look, you're buying artifacts that have been illegally smuggled and looted out of Iraq. And so he ignored that. So to conclude, there's a lot of open-ended questions, and maybe you'll have your thoughts on the matter, but some of the things we've said, should they be returned to their country? Does your opinion differ, whether it has to do with colonialism or some of these more recently excavated objects? Should there be a statute of limitations? Should it be finders keepers? You find something in your backyard, it belongs to you. That'd be nice if you're living in Italy and discovered a cache of, silver vessels. That'd be pretty cool if that was yours. But countries really see these objects as part of their cultural heritage and a way to bring money in, that it's a symbol of their country. And even places like Italy, they have the highest concentration, the highest density of classical antiquities, yet they are fighting tooth and nail to get those things back from the Getty. So, sorry I'm ending this with all these questions, but I'll let you chime in or ask your questions for Elena and me. And thank you for listening.
Generally, we just talk out. If you have a question.
I just want to say that I heard a talk by a man named James Cuno a few years ago. Yeah, at the time he was still at the Harvard Art Museum, and most of the talk was a 2-day series actually. It was titled "In Defense of the Museum," and it was definitely defending these kinds of practices. But he's the current director at the Getty now, so I don't see any changes coming in the near future.
And he also makes that case for the encyclopedic museum, and that's what I like to go to a museum and see all of, especially ancient art, look at all of them in relation to everything else. And the British Museum says that too, that you can go there and see all of antiquity laid before you and compare it to everything else.
How about seeing the context?
I'd like to see that too.
I mean, I just find it very troublesome, this whole idea of accessibility and, the idea that Sicily is less accessible than California. I mean, I think it's it depends who you ask, first of all. I mean, for people in Europe, Sicily is more accessible than California. I have been to Sicily. I probably have spent more time in Sicily than California. It's fabulous. I also have been to the museum you mentioned in Athens, and I have been there with a group of Lamar students, so we can see that stuff if it's there in Greece, and it's kind of cool to see it in Greece. You know, it's kind of cool to see the stuff in the environment that it kind of came from, and when you learn about the history, I mean, I like to learn about the history of Sicily when I'm in Sicily. I might be less concerned with it in California.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, I just think that it's a little bit of, you know, there is a kind of a Eurocentric, Western-centric worldview that comes into thinking that it's cooler to have the stuff in London than somewhere else. And that's just a defense of British imperialism, really.
One, I failed to mention that in the Acropolis Museum, you saw this, that where they are missing the real pieces, they have plaster casts. And so, you know, students, in one of my classes, we talk about copies and fakes and forgeries, and they would probably be okay with that, but
Well, why
the
can't
real
the
thing
British
is-
Museum have plaster
yeah,
casts?
that too.
I mean,
Why
they can
couldn't
get
it
plaster
be
casts too
reversed?
in London.
Yeah. Or
It's
I'll ask you a question. So it seems to me that traveling to these wonderful places is also privileged. And so I guess, how do you guys think about those people, the poor? There's more poor than even middle class on the planet. And that question of accessibility, how do you think about that?
Well, travel is more accessible now than it ever used to be, and unfortunately this also means that travel is more destructive than it ever needs to be. I mean, I used to live in Barcelona. Barcelona just elected a mayor 2 years ago on the campaign promise that she will reduce tourism. Please stop coming. Please, you're destroying our city, stop coming. So I think that one of the solutions to this is also to kind of spread the goods around a little bit, and instead of having these very trendy travel destinations, everybody goes here and here and here and here, just kind of have also travel to different places. I mean, not just these focal points where, you know, we are developing these capitals of travel that are oversaturated, where you no longer get an authentic experience anyway, you just get the cardboard version of whatever you want and a frozen meal. I mean, most restaurants in Paris serve you frozen food. I hate to say that to you, but it's true. So you're just like, people come to buy the experience is no longer there, locals don't get the experience anymore either. And again, it's become a very destructive industry. It's destructive partly because it's more affordable, but part of making it more sustainable is kind of investing a little more in the authenticity of things, and not people going to these big places and it's a free-for-all and you can get everything here. You know, it's like the island of Manhattan. Why would you ever have to leave? We have everything, and look, the Met has everything.
I think it's important to have artifacts here too, say for our Lamar students, and telling them in my Art History 1 class that yes, you can go to the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, or the Natural History Museum that has a good Egyptian collection, and you know, just playing a little bit of devil's advocate. And again, sometimes it's hard for me to make a decision, but it's nice if you can't travel further than say Houston, you can at least be exposed to these cultures.
Well, and what about loan programs from different countries? That's a way for them to have revenue, if you want.
Actually, I forgot to talk about that because I was gonna take the whole, you know, the myth of Persephone and how she ate the pomegranate seeds, and then she gets to be, you know, for 6 months in one place and 6 months. I mean, you know, you think of these museums too, and you think they paid money to have the works, and you don't want them to necessarily lose all that. It's not like the museum really truly did anything wrong. They didn't even know. So some of the agreements, I mean, that was what the Met did. You know, they decided to have some loan programs, give it back, get some other stuff. And that's a rotation of artifacts, and that's, you know, that's fun for us too. Again, if we're talking about Houston, and Houston has wonderful art, and I always encourage my students to go, and I always think don't just go to the Fine Arts Museum, go to the Menil because it's free and it's beautiful. But if you get the rotation, you don't get bored of it. You can go to the museum every season and see what is new at the museum. You want new stuff at the museum. So it's nice for this stuff to travel. It's good for everyone for it to travel.
I think I saw it.
I was just going to comment on appropriation being a little bit closer to home with the Byzantine friezes that the Menil had, and they returned to the Soviet government. So it's happened here in Texas too.
Yeah, I completely forgot about that one. I should have mentioned it since it's close to home.
Actually, related to that, even more locally, I taught a course on local architecture and history of Beaumont. And Charles Bullock, who's an archaeologist locally, was telling me that we had some very interesting Native American burial mounds on the Neches River there. And they have been totally destroyed by the city because they realized that the clamshells and other things made very good surface for roads. So, in fact, another thing is just to look at what you have here and to not always think that, what we have here is worthless and that elsewhere it's so much more important. Is that there's plenty of things here that are of interest that we need to place value on. So.
I guess that makes me a plunderer because my father used to take us in a rowboat across the river and we would go to those shell mounds. And some of the things that we found are in the little windmill museum down in Eden.
Oh, as long as someone else can see it. That's
But we actually, my sister found a corn husk doll, and she kept it in her top drawer for years, and it just crumbled to bits. But it was really.
So I was in Egypt. I traveled through Egypt in 2008 before all the uprising and stuff, and I enjoy very much seeing locally in the sites with the artifacts, the statues, the hieroglyph paint without like having a whole frieze removed. So all that I totally agree with supporting the local places. When I was visiting the older museum in Cairo, the artifacts were not well taken care of, except for the Tutankhamun's mask was good, although they broke something.
The beard.
Yeah, they broke the beard, and I remember talking about it, and there's some notes on that. But some of the things didn't have labels. Some of the things were like covered in dust because they were not really taken care of. They were saying, when the new museum opened, everything would be great. But I felt that if I was in the British Museum or if I was in, Paris, I would see these artifacts to their splendor, not to like this decay. So I was
The
very
Western world
conflicted.
is so superior.
Huh?
They can take better care of artifacts.
Yeah. So for me, I was like very conflicted because all these beautiful things, like you see the paintings with the with the restoration. Like there's also dangers of restoration, obviously, but it was such decay and there was not like people really attending to these things. You could touch them. You touch sarcophagi on the galleries, which obviously in other museums that wasn't allowed. But I felt that, I was glad to be able to see the actual Tutankhamun's mask, as opposed to like a rendition of Nefertiti that was in the museum. Like, okay, this is how it looks like, but we don't have it. So it's really conflicted in this case. But I was just wondering, how do you feel about with this 3D technology that exists now, that you could have more than plasters, you could recreate the object, right?
Yeah, that's one of the things they're doing in Syria. Is there's been an artist that recreates things with 3D printers. They also recreated a huge arch from, I think it was Palmyra in London, to call attention to what was happening in Syria. And I guess it's better than nothing, isn't it? I've been to museums too and see copies of things, and like I remember in Toronto I saw the Palette of Narmer, and I thought, well, this looks like I imagined it to be. I wouldn't know that it's not the real thing. So I suppose we could just have copies around. I also wonder, you mentioned the Grand Egyptian Museum. Every semester I have to check to see when it opens. I had to do that actually. I'm starting Egyptian art tomorrow in one of my classes, and I have to check because I think it was supposed to open in 2011, and now they say it'll partially open in 2018. So I think once all those objects get transferred over there, it should be a state-of-the-art museum, but we'll see. Hopefully I'll get to Egypt one day. I know there's a question behind.
Well, I just wanted to say, like, I kind of experienced the same conflict that you were talking about in Guatemala last summer whenever I was staying in a very small town. And the woman I was staying with had collected over 900 Mayan artifacts basically in her backyard. And she just kind of had them in boxes and like sort of a few on a shelf. And she kind of just like let me go in there and touch it all. And like, I'm like, this is so incredibly old and you're just like laying it out here and letting me touch it. And I'm like, why don't you like do something, you know, to like preserve them? And she's like, I don't know how, I don't really have the money to do it, but like also I don't want them to be gone from the place where they came from too. But she had issues as well with people coming and trying to take artifacts from her. And she was like very careful to watch me as I was looking at them.
Did you lose her gloves?
She didn't hit anything. She was just letting us look.
Yeah, so when you were talking about art and crime and what ISIS did in Iraq, I was kind of thinking about Pakistan and Afghanistan because parts of northern Pakistan and Afghanistan have been home to Gandhara and Buddhist civilizations. So when the militants took over some of those areas, they destroyed those sculptures, stole the artifacts, and nobody knows what happened to them after that. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on
Yeah,
that.
the Taliban was doing the same thing as ISIS, where they were smuggling those goods out, selling them. Again, I don't know if it was on eBay, but they were selling objects and funding terrorism and like you said, destroying things too as they went. So sad story with the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan. Those were destroyed in 2001.
So have you seen any independent reporting or research on what happened in that area and what happened after that?
I mean, I've read stuff on it. I can't give you the citation off the top of my head, but you know, I've read just generally, I guess I should say. I'd have to look a little bit more to see what exactly happened to those objects. I think a lot of people now are buying stuff for themselves. The Chinese, the Russians, they're all about acquiring their own art collections. And so my guess would be that they're in private hands. Maybe museums, the United States, our museums are getting more strict after the Getty, the Metropolitan, all of these museums, they have stricter acquisition policies where something has to be, I think it's 36 years old or have a very clear-cut provenance. But if you're a private collector, there's probably a lot more, no one's breathing down your neck and looking at what you're doing, like some of those big museums.
Is there any estimation as to what the private collection value looks like out there in terms of unknown?
Well, the only statistic I can think of is that ISIS one with Syria, where $11 million of Syrian antiquities were imported and bought in the United States in, I think, a year. I'd have to double check that. But that gives you at least
there's no trail on it.
yeah.
Also, did you know private collectors usually touch the art? I mean, it's a very known thing to do. That's part of why some people want to own the stuff, and they touch it. Sometimes they have parties, they invite their friends to touch it. So speaking of touching ancient artifacts and stuff, I know people who have bragged about touching very famous things because somebody owned it, and part of the joy of ownership, of private ownership, was you get to interact with it in all kinds of ways that you don't in a museum.
So how do you stop it? Like if
People touching art?
no, how do you stop from artifacts being stolen? I mean, whose job is it to police the world? How can we stop eBay?
Nobody polices the world.
Well, okay. Well, I mean, then somebody needs to police the world.
Well, there may be education too. If, if we at least know this is going on. I don't have a collection of ancient art, but if I did, I would do my due diligence.
Touch it.
Yeah.
Well, that was one of my expectations when I saw the Cuno lecture a few years ago. I was kind of hoping that we would have a discussion of these complex issues rather than just all museums are good or all museums are bad kind of talk. I mean, I think a lot of us want to keep museums. We want museums, we want accessibility. It's debatable which ones are going to be more or less accessible. I think sometimes, I agree, there's some claims where there's this kind of assumption something will be more accessible somewhere, and that's an assumption we can certainly challenge, because those are just claims sometimes people are making. But in reality, we can't just say, let's return every artifact to its country of origin, because even those countries of origin are debatable. We talk about Greek and Roman artifacts and which country should it go to? Was it acquired legally back when it was acquired by the Romans, or was it, you know, pilfered at that time? But
the Italians have an art squad that they've got the
Yeah.
biggest one that tracks down antiquities. So there are organizations like that.
so if we're doing our
But
homework,
there's
like you're saying.
I don't think we're ever going to get rid of it.
But if we
So-
raise awareness,
Yeah.
it's harder to do this stuff. I mean, if we raise awareness, even the fact that we're sitting here in a room and we're talking about this and we're talking like it's a serious problem.
Yeah.
I think, again, you said it, you said education. It's education. Education is part of it. There will be more transparency in the process if the public at large is more educated. And then, of course, we want the collectors and the museums and so on to be educated. I mean, museums don't set out to do harm, obviously. They believe in preserving culture. So talking about it more, thinking about it more, I think that's already doing something.
Let's thank these guys.
Interesting and important topic, you guys. Lots to think about. Well, thank you so much for being our conversationalist.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And thank you all for coming. We'll see you in another conversation.